Today on CityCast Chicago, it's been 3 years since the first COVID shutdowns hit Illinois. I'm joined by lead producer Carrie Shepard and producer Simone Alisea as we talk about what's changed and what hasn't. Plus, with early voting now open in the April 4th election, we got to look at some aldermanic runoffs worth watching. It's Tuesday, March 21st. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Three years ago today, Illinoisans were ordered to stay at home as COVID-19 swept through the world. And let's be real, most of us thought maybe 2 or 3 weeks tops, but oh, were we wrong. We're all still truly feeling the effects of those early days. Carrie, before the pandemic, I didn't even know you existed, and now we are thick as thieves. What feels different and what feels the same 1,000 days later?
Yeah, well, that feels different in a good way. I agree. I didn't know you either, Jacoby. I was downtown actually this weekend. I went to a movie on Saturday and went to dinner after, and I realized it was maybe only my second movie in 3 years in a movie theater. It was fairly busy, and maybe like half of us masked up, half of us not. Walking around at that time, it was like late afternoon. There were tourists out. This is like Central Loop. So we were at the Gene Siskel, so it's like State and Lake. There were definitely tourists out, tourists walking around. It was cold as hell too, so that could have kept some people away. But then as we walked west toward the river to go to dinner, and this is kind of common even before the pandemic in the Loop, as you get kind of in the financial district, you see fewer people because it is so much a kind of Monday through Friday area. And a lot of restaurants and stuff in that area, especially like lunch places, they don't even open on the weekends because they don't have, they just don't have the clientele, right? But it did make me think a lot. And the three of us have talked about this before, like we do have these little pockets in the Loop of like local family-owned businesses. Like I was like, oh, there's that tailor, and there's this shop, and and like, how are these people surviving if fewer people are going to work Monday through Friday in the Loop? And then I saw this Sun-Times article on Monday, and this was all sort of essentially about that, how Chicago businesses are adapting 3 years after shutdown. And there were some profiles of some businesses and how they've kind of changed their model. Obviously there was Atlas Stationers is the stationery store, and they sell fountain pens and stuff. They moved some of their business online. But then there are other places that just like maybe don't have that option. And so they're still kind of crawling out, trying to get that foot traffic they rely on.
I'm not gonna lie, I still feel a small amount of guilt at just how much more outside I've been. And it depends where I'm at. So I've started going back to movies, I've started going back to theaters, but over the weekend, obviously, we're 2 years since we launched the podcast, and our first episode was about what are people doing for St. Patrick's Day. And now I'm out celebrating St. Patrick's Day with my friends on a birthday bar crawl. And at one point during maybe the second or third bar, that sort of guilt just washed over me, because when you're standing shoulder to shoulder next to people, you can't, at least I can't help but think like, I mean, we're not out of the pandemic. Some of the people are masked up here. But then I'm thinking like, but I do want to patronage these bars, these theaters, these restaurants I haven't been able to go to because I know they've got their own COVID story. And so I'm just sort of washed over with this, like, what's the best decision? Like, what decision should I be making right now? And even still, I never know if I'm making the right decision, not only for my health, but the health of my family, the health of my friends. And so, Simone, of course, like I just said, COVID hasn't gone away. What do some of those numbers look like at this point, and what have we learned?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been so long, I feel like, since we talked about the numbers, right? Back in March of 2020, in those early months, that was an everyday occurrence. You're sitting there looking at those bar graphs, looking at how many infections, how many deaths, what is happening right now in Illinois. 3 years on,
You was getting like a Facebook Live from the public health
yeah,
office every couple of
every couple,
days.
well, and even for, that whole year, every week, even at least. Um, here's what we know now: nearly 37,000 people have died from COVID-19 in Illinois, and that with more than 4 million confirmed infections, and that's probably an undercount because it doesn't count like at-home tests or people who just have been undiagnosed. Um, the good news in those numbers, those are awful numbers. We don't like to we don't like to hear any of that. The good news is in that is, we went from 150 COVID deaths per day in late 2020 to fewer than 10 now, to about 9
Mm.
daily deaths per day. In the aggregate, we're seeing disparities. We heard so much in 2020 and 2021 about the way that COVID disproportionately affected Latino and Black residents across Illinois. In the aggregate, those disparities are also declining. Of course, you get down to the neighborhood level, that starts to change a little bit, but in the aggregate, things are looking good. And Dr. Artie Barnes with the state health department said that after the Omicron surge of late 2021, which really threatened to overwhelm our healthcare system, which that was the big thing: flatten the wave. We don't want to overwhelm the
Mhm.
hospitals. After that, it looks like we're at a point where this virus, the way it's affecting people, we're seeing fewer hospitalizations, fewer deaths, which also means that our healthcare systems are navigating this in a way with less pressure and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the good news 3 years out. I think the bad news
Mhm.
is we're still talking about this. um, we're still having this conversation.
And not only we're still having this conversation, but it's in some ways it's turned. So there's still people dealing with the symptoms from long COVID,
Hmm.
right? We talk about businesses. There are some businesses that not only did they not get to open back up, but they've closed down for good. And so if you're someone who's listening, we'd love to hear how you're dealing with things 3 years since the start of the pandemic. Please feel free to leave us a text or a voicemail at 773-780-0246. We want to continue to hear your stories on how the pandemic has and continues to impact you and your family. As we all know, we are just a couple of weeks away from finishing out our election season with our runoff. And it's not just all the mayor's race. We have 14 wards that are going to be seeing runoff races for their alders. Now, most of these are for open seats, but we're going to focus on races where incumbents could be reelected or lose their jobs come April 4th. Simone, can you catch up with what's happening in the 45th ward on the northwest side? Arguably one of the spiciest wards we've got.
Yes, certainly something that longtime listeners of CityCast Chicago and even short-term listeners of CityCast Chicago will be familiar with. We talk about this ward a lot. Just to kind of recap why we talk about this ward, the incumbent Jim Gardner facing just a bevy of allegations, everything from harassment and intimidation to even bribery, being investigated by several different entities. And this was a really, really close race. The results were kind of in flux as mail-in ballots were coming in, and Gardner nearly avoided a runoff. But in the end, after the final results came out last week, ended up with only 48% of the vote. He now faces attorney Megan Matthias in on April 4. And going to be really interesting to see how he, obviously he did really, really well despite these allegations, despite kind of these controversies. But in a head-to-head race, will that translate? Or we're already seeing some of the supporters of some of the other candidates in that race, coalesce behind Matthias. I think there is certainly a push for change in that ward. So yeah, definitely one we're going to watch for sure.
I don't want to stay here too long, but I have to ask you, Simone, as much coverage as we've put on this race, which is much coverage as we've seen our friends put on, with all these allegations from harassment and intimidation to even the sort of what some of his supporters have done to others, running their car into people's flower beds. Are you shocked that the race was this close?
This is my first municipal election in Chicago that I'm covering as a reporter. So it may not shock you to know that I was a little surprised. I think I didn't expect him to do quite so well. I certainly expected him to make a runoff. But that it was this close and we really had to wait for those mail-in ballots, which again, just goes to show you your vote matters, even if you turn it in. Like, even if you're turning it in by mail, even if you're turning it in on election day, your vote matters.
Yeah. Voters in the 29th ward on the far west side will also see a runoff. C-Shep, can you get in there? Who's running there in the 29th?
Sure. So this is the incumbent, Chris Taliaferro, and he is running against community organizer C.B. Johnson. And to be clear, the 29th ward, this includes the, far west side of the city. So Austin and going Belmont, Cragen, Galewood, Dunning, Mount Clair. And Chris Taliaferro, the incumbent, was a Mayor Lightfoot backer, including endorsing her for a second term, and is a chair of, the Public Safety Committee. C.B. Johnson, and this race is so close. This is basically this is a couple dozen votes, okay? As Simone is saying, your vote matters. This is so close. Community organizer C.B. Johnson has worked with, I think, drug awareness, drug prevention in the area, is challenging Taliaferro.
Staying with you, Carrie, there's also a runoff in another West Side ward that spans, a lot of neighborhoods. We know how our ward map is drawn. Can you tell us about this long stretch, a.k.a. the 36?
I can, and I can tell you that I get a lot of mailers because I live in the 36, and we get a lot of mailers. So the 36 is this weird, snake-like thing that is going all the way from, West Town, Ukrainian Village, Humboldt Park, where I am, all the way north up also to, I think, Belmont, Cragen. It's just this really skinny, weird.
It's basically just Grand Avenue all the way up.
It's just Grand Avenue North, yeah. So the incumbent is Gilbert Villegas, and you may remember us talking about him here because he also ran for congressman last fall. And Villegas is facing Lori Torres Witt. And Villegas is sort of, as I'm looking at this mailer, he is jumping on Witt's, I guess, backers of Witt's have said defund the police, abolish prisons. And he's kind of saying, and he, however, wants to move the police district, which used to be closer and is now our district, our headquarters is very far away from where we are now. He's saying that maybe the rise in crime has to do with that the police headquarters is not close enough to the neighborhood. So Villegas, like I said, incumbent, ran unsuccessfully for congressman, facing Lori Torres Witt in the runoff.
Yeah. Obviously, we're seeing this happen across races, but watching people sort of get into the defund, fund police sort of bastardized conversation, obviously is politics for politics' sake. But it's really... it's annoying.
It's really reductive.
Just watching years and years of organizing work unfairly snapshot in these small little talking points. It's ridiculous. But again, we're seeing it happen across politics, and I'm interested to see where that conversation moves once we get out of election season and people have to start passing budgets and things. Outgoing Mayor Lori Lightfoot appointed 4 new city council members last year. We were following this closely because it was happening all over the city, whether it was in Bridgeport, whether it was in North Lawndale, whether it was up in Uptown, on the north side of the city. But those 4 city council members, they did not get the head start they were hoping for. Simone, how did they fare in our election season?
Yeah, right. You would think that having that appointment, having, in some cases, something like 10 months in office before the election would help you. But they're not faring that well. One, Annabella Barca lost outright in the 12th ward on the southwest side. She lost in February to Julia Ramirez. And then the other 3 are all facing runoffs here in April. Just a quick rundown of those races. That's in the 11th ward, Bridgeport, Chinatown area. We've talked about that on the show a lot. Nicole Lee faces police officer Anthony Ciaravino. In the 43rd Ward in Lincoln Park on the north side, Timmy Knudsen faces neighborhood advocate Brian Comer. And the 24th Ward, which covers North Lawndale, a little bit of Little Village on the west side there, Monique Scott faces business owner Creative Scott, who is not related to her, no relation to the Scotts.
The race of the Scots.
The race of
yes.
so many Scots in the 24th Ward.
So many Scots.
Monique Scott, of course, taking that seat from her brother when she was appointed to that race. Obviously, there's specific things happening in each of these wards, specific concerns residents in those wards have. But as a trend, when you look at these four candidates, the association with Lightfoot doesn't seem to be helping them. Maybe not that surprising, given that Lightfoot came in third as the incumbent, the first incumbent in 4 decades, not to win a second term. So I don't think it's terribly surprising that association didn't, pull more weight for these 4 candidates. But will kind of be interesting to see, can they overcome that? And again, what specific issues in those wards can they speak to win voters?
I know people have been trying, and some have not, to have a nuanced conversation. And I want us to return to this after. But again, if you put this map on our city next to almost every other map of our city, there is a racial dynamic here that needs to be broken down. And I know we will have this conversation moving forward. Early voting is now open across the city. If you have a runoff in your ward, you can help select the next alderperson. And if you're still deciding between Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallis in the mayoral race, they'll both be debating on WGN tonight at 7. There's also a forum on Thursday in Austin. And we're interviewing candidate Brandon Johnson later this week, and we'll bring you that conversation next Monday. We have invited Paul Vallis onto the show as well, and that invitation remains good.
Hi, I'm Carrie Shepard, lead producer of CityCast Chicago. In the many years of being a journalist in this city, I've heard and told all kinds of stories about people who work to make Chicago better, policies that help some but not all, and of course, the ugly stories that make us feel angry, hurt, and ashamed. But I'd never heard the story of Leonard Clark. Until I binged the new podcast, You Didn't See Nothing, from USG Audio and the Invisible Institute. In 1997, Leonard Clark was a 13-year-old black boy who was beaten into a coma by a gang of white teens. Johannes LaCour hosts You Didn't See Nothing, and he's here to tell you why you have to listen immediately to this podcast like I did recently. Hi, Johannes.
Hey, Carrie. How you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for doing this. It's so nice to meet you and to listen to this podcast that is just incredible. But let's start with the story of Leonard Clark. It's the 26th anniversary of this terrible event, March 21st, 1997. What happened to Leonard Clark on that day?
That day, Leonard Clark traveled across an imaginary line in Chicago that separated the all-black projects and Stateway Gardens he was from the all-white, historically racist neighborhood of Bridgeport. His bike tire had a flat, and so he was looking for air in the neighborhood of Bridgeport, which was across the expressway by design. Think Sundown Town. When he got there, he was beaten into a coma by a gang of white young men, and that changed the course of his life.
How was the media in Chicago and nationally covering this story?
In the immediate hours and days after, they covered it responsibly. But shortly after that, the media coverage became about racial reconciliation, healing, and forgiveness. And that was prompted more by the people. So many black so-called activists and leaders started to have a change of heart for reasons that the podcast dives into. And that journalism then became very sloppy, irresponsible. I didn't discover how poorly it was being covered until I started covering it myself.
How did you start your career in investigative journalism around this time?
Well, after I heard about what happened, I had wanted to do something about it. Had been a writer since I was a youngster. My father knew about a small local newspaper that was also based in the projects and said, maybe you should try writing about it. I did that. I met a guy named Ron Carter at the South Street Journal who had an amazing network all throughout the South Side. He was able to put me on the ground with people who knew Leonard and his family personally. And that just opened it all up to me. And that just changed my life.
25 years later, what is the story You Didn't See Nothing trying to tell about Leonard Clark now?
The You Didn't See Nothing isn't about Leonard Clark, the person right now, as much as it is about the fact that most Black folks are Leonard Clark. Most Black folks have been abused and injured by, the white supremacist dynamics of this country in a way that has not been told. And so it's really about the fact that there's still a lot of repair that is due. And in addition to repairing what's been damaged, which is, the bodies and souls and minds of Black folks, it's also about repairing a system so that we can prevent it. I feel like that's a lot of what we're hoping to get across in terms of the story of Leonard Clark, how relevant it still is today.
You say the podcast is part investigation, part memoir. While doing You Didn't See Nothing, what did you learn about yourself, Johannes?
Wow, how much time we got. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about my own virtues and flaws. I learned a lot about how I look at the world, and I learned a lot about why this particular story has stayed with me so much, and why my passion for Black folks and justice and my need to root for the underdog has been so strong throughout my life. But it's been a hell of a journey that's included a lot of soul searching.
The story of Leonard Clark and what was happening in Chicago at the time is such a compelling, amazing story. And Johannes, you are really the perfect guide for it.
Thank you.
Johannes LaCour is host of the podcast You Didn't See Nothing. It's produced by USG Audio and the Invisible Institute, the producers of the 2020 Pulitzer finalist podcast, Somebody. You can binge all 7 episodes, like I did, of You Didn't See Nothing now wherever you get your podcasts.
Before I let you go, some good news to get you through. Join me tonight at G-Man Tavern in Wrigleyville, where I'll be performing alongside some of the best writers and storytellers in the city for the anniversary show of Write Club. I'll drop a ticket link for you in the show notes. As always, we appreciate you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, at chicago.citycast.fm. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Peace.
No, it used to be the Ginger Man. What did it used to be called? Now that sounds weird, but I do think it was Ginger. Yeah, the Ginger Man Tavern.
I always thought
That's
it's like a G-Man. Like when you describe someone as a G-Man, they're like an FBI agent. They're like a government man. That's what I always thought it referred to.
Maybe they were like Ginger Man sounds stupid, but the bartender used to look exactly like John Cusack. And if you'd had a few too many, you'd be like, but seriously, are you John Cusack? Like, are you?